Bien, on va commencer. Alors, la forme d'articulation, d'hybridation, de combinaison ontologique qu'on va examiner aujourd'hui est très particulière. Michael Scott, qui enseigne à la London School of Economics en anthropologie, étudie depuis pas mal d'années une île des îles Salomon, Mélanésie, qui s'appelle Makira, et dans cette île, une population qui s'appelle les Arosi. Et ce qu'il a mis en lumière dans son travail, notamment dans une monographie qu'il a publiée il y a quelques années qui s'appelle The Severed Snake, le serpent coupé en morceaux, c'est qu'il y avait une double combinaison ontologique dans cette population. D'une part, et à la différence de la doxa, disons, de l'anthropologie mélanésianiste, qui, à la suite d'un fameux article de Julian Barnes dans les années 60, c'était les années 60, si mes souvenirs sont bons, oui, avait fait la critique de l'analyse des formes de socialité et d'organisation sociale, disons, mélanésiennes, de l'analyse de ces formes en disant la plupart des chercheurs analysent ces sociétés en utilisant les modèles africains, c'est-à-dire en utilisant des modèles de filiation, de groupes de filiation, des clans, des lignages, etc., alors que, en fait, ces modèles ne sont pas adéquats pour décrire la réalité des sociétés de Mélanésie. Et puis après, il y a eu des auteurs de grand renom comme Marilyn Strathern ou Roy Wagner qui ont développé l'idée qu'au fond, ce qui était très important en Mélanésie, c'était en effet pas du tout les groupes de filiation, mais la façon dont la personne humaine était constituée par des relations multiples avec d'autres humains, mais aussi des non-humains. Et ce que Michael Scott a mis en lumière chez les Arosi de cette île de Makira, c'est qu'en réalité, cette façon de voir ne convenait pas tout à fait à l'analyse de la population qu'il étudiait, puisque on était face à ce qu'il a appelé une polyontologie, c'est-à-dire que les groupes de filiation qui sont très présents dans cette population au fond, s'appuie sur l'idée que chaque groupe de filiation qui est localisé dans un lieu d'origine, à des mythes de fondation, etc., constitue une sorte d'espèce à part. Et donc on a quelque chose qui ressemble assez au modèle du totémisme australien, tel que j'ai voulu, en tout cas, le défendre comme idée du totémisme. Donc on a cet aspect-là, une polyontologie, et puis un autre aspect qui est la christianisation de cette population, comme c'est le cas partout en Mélanésie, avec donc un message chrétien qui est fondé sur le monogénisme. Toute l'espèce humaine a une même origine, et par conséquent, il s'agit d'une mono-ontologie, si je puis dire. Le monogénisme s'opposant au polygénisme de la façon dont la population Arosi se concevait elle-même. Et donc cette double tension a été l'objet des analyses de Michael Scott depuis des années, et c'est ce dont il va nous parler aujourd'hui. Alors l'exposé sera en anglais. Voilà. Thank you, Michael. The floor is yours.
Merci. Thank you, Philippe, for those generous words of introduction and for integrating me into your cosmopolitics of scholarship here, your seminar. It's a great honor, indeed, to be given an opportunity to participate in this unique form of dialogue. which I think is devoted to our shared interest in comparative cosmology and ontology. So having welcomed me so warmly, I hope you'll now forgive me if, for the brief interval of my presentation, I refer to you, Philippe, rather distantly as Descola. Pardon this formality. It seems both necessary and awkward as I seek to engage with, and I hope augment and vindicate the approach to comparative ontology you've outlined in your book, Beyond Nature and Culture. Well, as you've mentioned, my main fieldwork, consultants over the last 2.5 decades, have been the people known as Erosi, a population of about 9,400 Melanesians. The name Erosi has come to refer not only to this population, but also to their local Austronesian language and to their home region. The latter, Erosi as a geographical location, lies at the far northwest end of the island of Makira in what is now the Pacific nation-state of Solomon Islands. The Solomons make up an archipelago that extends just southeast of Papua New Guinea, and Makira is the southernmost large island in this chain. Makira's nearest neighbors among the large islands are Guadalcanal to the west, where the national capital, Honiara, is seated, and Malaita to the north. Historically, Britain has been the main colonial presence in Solomon Islands. The archipelago was declared a British protectorate in 1893 and has been a member of the British Commonwealth as an independent nation since 1978. Now, in my ethnographic publications, I've argued that everyday thought and practice among the Erosi warrant a theorization of an indigenous ontology for which I have coined the term polyontology. To state its defining features in brief, Erosi polyontology posits a plurality of radically distinct, heterogeneously autochthonous matrilineal categories, each characterized by unity of being with a unique ancestral territory. This has the effect of composing the island of Makira as an island of islands, each with its own discrete autochthonous power, or mena, the Erosi cognate of the oceanic mana, and its own matrilineally defined ancestors, humans, non-human extensions, and moral order, or what Erosi talk about as the ringi auhenua, or the custom or way of the autochthonous lineage of its territory. In my past efforts to identify this fundamentally pluralist but non-Cartesian mode of being and compare it with others, I have described Erosi polyontology as a non-Cartesian, matrilineal essentialism that differs both from Cartesian dualism and from the relational non-dualism implied by the influential models of Melanesian personhood and sociality developed by Roy Wagner and Marilyn Strathern. More recently, I have also found it helpful, vindicating even, to be able to point out that Erosi polyontology has much in common with totemism as re-theorized by Philippe Descola. Over the years, there have been times when I have felt hard-pressed to convince other Melanesianists that, contrary to Strathern's model of the exclusively relational Melanesian person with no core essence, that there are Melanesians who experience their composite natures as ruled by an enduring matrilineal substance, a substance that is one among many, but distinct from all others, and privileged as the defining and immutable core of any person. Accordingly, I have welcomed Descola's re-theorization of totemism, taking it to be a kind of independent witness to the reality of lived ontologies that posit a discontinuous humanity. Today, I want to take this opportunity to explain how, in my present thinking and writing, Descola's work again is coming to my aid, helping me to analyze the local features of Erosi paleontology more fully, and thereby defend paleontology from assimilation to the premises of yet another potentially homogenizing theory, the perspectival anthropology of Eduardo Viveras de Castro. As I will elaborate in the opening ethnographic sections of my paper, Erosi paleontology fits Descola's definition of a totemism, but owing to several of its local features, it also entails an intrinsic ambiguity of totemic scale, not commonly found in totemisms in Aboriginal Australia. In Erosi, the primordial totemic beings, and so also the matrilineal defined classes of being they generate, are at once terramorphic, that is, they are land bodies, and ophiomorphic, they are snake bodies. There are, according to some indices of Erosi tradition, that these land snakes or snake lands are able to slide from the scale of a single matrilineal territory to the scale of the island of Makira as a whole and back again. They thus appear paradoxically to be many snakes and one snake at the same time. For Erosi, this ambiguity has rendered their ontological premises amenable to diverse historical transformations in dialogue with colonially introduced Christianity and naturalism. For me, as an ethnographer of Erosi, it has also posed a less personally consequential, but nonetheless challenging analytical problem. The sliding scales of Erosi paleontology can seem to mandate a total reanalysis of Erosi ontology as a form of animism. The primordial island scale snake, according to such a rethink, is like the primordial human of Amazonian cosmogony. It constitutes a kind of Deleuzian virtual, and all the matrilineal snake territories constitute diverse actualizations of this primordial land. Reconceptualized along these lines, Erosi matrilineages would inevitably all share, as their intrinsic multiplicity, the same insular plenitude despite their supposed differences. They would be like the differentiated bodies of animism, always already intrinsically related. My overall aim here, however, is to explore how Descola's approach to comparative ontology can provide tools needed to explicate in detail why it would be a mistake to assimilate this distinctive version of totemism to a version of animism. Descola's approach, I have found, has the potential to afford clear and cogent criteria for resisting the Deleuzian deluge that arguably threatens to swamp all differences between ontological regimes, deducing each ontology from all and all from each as actualizations of the same infinitely self-differential virtue. But there's a rub. In order for me to implement Descola's grid of 4 modes of identification to its fullest advantage and employ it to save Erosi paleontology from the jaws of an omnivorous animism, I'm going to have to tamper with it just a bit. Descola's grid is already a powerful explanatory tool, able to account for a wide variety of systematic differences and processes of transformation across historical and contemporary lived ontologies. But I respectfully submit that a few important adjustments are needed to refine its principal terms and thereby further augment its analytical purchase on the differences that make a difference. So I'm going to try to persuade you that my research on Erosi paleontology recommends 3 fundamental modifications and 3 ancillary annotations to Descola's grid. At first, these changes may seem to undermine the validity of the grid and its generative core, the internality-physicality relation. But as I hope will soon transpire, my intention is entirely the opposite. My findings, in fact, endorse the basic theory and methodology of the grid, inclusive of its core relation. Before I can begin to re-diagram Descola's grid, however, and use my revised version of it to show why Erosi paleontology is not a form of animism, I must first give a fuller account of Erosi paleontology and its sliding scales of double continuity. This will better precipitate the problem vis-à-vis animism that I'm trying to solve. Now, in everyday life, the premises of Erosi paleontology are most legible to analysis in the images and practices that constitute Erosi or matrilineal exogamy and reproduction. Every Erosi person, according to Erosi, is the site of what they described as the entanglement of the diverse matrilineal continuities that have, over the course of generations, fed into the production of his or her parents and converged to make a new person. To this extent, the Erosi person may be described as composite, but he or she is not a individual with no core essence. Erosi assert that the component one receives matrilineally, which they speak of as the mena, or power, of matrilineal blood, remains pure and overrides all others. This mode of exogamous reproduction entails a paradox, however. In order to remain pure and unbroken, each transgenerationally matrilineal substance must be intersected by another. Its wholeness and continuity must be ruptured by the substance of the father's matrilineage in order for it to carry on unchanged in the couple's children. This discontinuous continuity is nicely figured in one of the most common Erosi terms for a matrilineage, waipo, which means also means umbilical cord and navel. The cord of the father's matrilineal substance passes through and cuts the mother's matrilineal substance. But no matter how many times this happens, the cord of the mother's matrilineal substance remains whole, not only across matrilineal generations, but also in each child of a matrilineage. A matrilineage is both one and many iterations of itself. It is indivisible despite many cuts, yet infinitely divisible into many parts that are also intrinsically interconnected wholes. It displays, in other words, a kind of scale-invariant self-similarity and a conversion of unique matrilineal substance. I have always argued that Arosi matrilineal origin stories constitute another data set from which one may infer the premises of Arosi paleontology. Like the matrilineages of which they tell, these stories are many and fundamentally unrelated. There are no unified or totalizing cosmogonic myths among the Arosi. Although Arosi think of and often guard their matrilineal origin stories as unique, these stories, in fact, share a limited repertoire of motifs, representing descent from autochthonous entities, which is to say, spontaneously arising earth beings, and constitute variants of one another. Thus, three different Arosi matrilineages understand themselves to be descended from the asexually produced daughters of different snakes. Each of these snake daughters procreated with a different male of unspecified origin to produce a truly human baby girl. Members of another matrilineage claim that their first truly human ancestress was the progeny of a kakamora, a kind of autochthonous dwarf still said to inhabit Makira, who married a Masi, a different kind of primordial quasi-human being, said now to be extinct owing to their comical self-destructive stupidity. Another matrilineage traces itself to the pre-human daughter of a stone that was also a female person. Another says its pre-human progenitor was sung forth by a bird. Still others describe their pre-human forebears as wild adaros, a type of elemental island being. These entities, according to the narratives, procreated with males of unspecified origin, to whom they appeared as beautiful women. Now, in comparison with cosmogonies from the ancient Mediterranean world, India, China, Polynesia, and the Americas, these origin stories are remarkable for the many kinds of things and questions to which they appear to be uninterested. Although the snake origin stories usually tell how the snake progenitors produced cultigens and fruit trees and pigs for their so-called daughters, these stories make no attempt to account for major entities such as celestial bodies, the oceans and their inhabitants, or places beyond Makira. Even more striking are the uninterrogated and unexplained origins of the masculine gendered beings with whom the so-called daughters of the primordial progenitors marry to produce truly human apical ancestresses for their matrilineages. If brought together like the pieces of a puzzle, the picture these stories suggest is one of atomistic pre-human entities and asexually extended pre-social categories colliding with one another to produce true humans. Just as Aphrodite is said to account for atomic swerve in the Epicurean cosmogony, so it appears that these atomistic entities come together in ways that engender gender, as well as a plurality of categorically distinct first humans. It must be that these pre-human entities appear to one another now as male, now as female, in multiple reciprocal cross pairings. The only pairings attended to in these narratives, however, are those that position a truly human baby girl as the conduit through their pre-human mother as the unique autochthonous category of being that she, in turn, passes on to her daughters and their daughters down to the present. In the early 1990s, when I first did fieldwork in Erosi, many people were quietly preoccupied with affirming the radical discontinuity among their territorially specific matrilineages in the context of latent land disputes. Invoking diverse images and narratives, they insisted that Makira had long ago been divided into mutually exclusive territories, territories that came into being as and with their matrilineal categories. Different matrilineages, they agreed, could all be autochthonous to Makira, but each was autochthonous differently. Each matrilineage had gradually come into being not only as a human category, but also as an area of land with distinctive features, trees, taboos, and customs, all shaped by the movements and the deeds of its earliest exemplars. In any particular area of land, they were keen to teach me, there could be but one true autochthonous matrilineage, only one true autochthonous matrilineage in any particular area of land. There is indeed much evidence in Erosi daily life to support this model of ontology, which meets Descola's criteria for totemism. To spell this out, humans and non-humans within each matrilineal category co-participate in double continuity, continuity of internality and continuity of physicality. At the same time, these matrilineal categories coexist vis-a-vis one another in double discontinuity, discontinuity of internality and discontinuity of physicality. But Erosi have long been contending with the fact that there is also another fundamentally incompatible way of reading their ontological disposition on their island. According to this alternative reading, the island of Makira constitutes a higher level of encompassment, uniting all of its autochthonous matrilineages into one comprehensive double continuity, or island-wide totemic class. These two competing scales of Erosi paleontology, the insular scale and the matrilineal scale, come into view most clearly in Erosi variants of the myth of the severed snake. This myth, or motif, is a recurring element within a larger transformational complex of snake myths widely attested throughout island Melanesia. Today, many Erosi know it simply as the story of how the once spontaneous and prodigious productivity of Makira came to be depleted and in need of periodic revival. In many versions, the snake appears to represent the generative power of Makira as a whole and to be the source of the cultigens, fruit and nut trees, pigs, and the first humans, the first true humans, and humans on the island. For some Erosi, however, and people elsewhere on other islands, it is the story of how their unique matrilineage got started. I recorded two such versions in which the snake appears to be the initially isolated and self-replicating pre-human progenitor of one particular matrilineal category alone. These two versions are, in fact, the origin stories that pertain to two of the three previously mentioned Erosi matrilineages whose members have claimed to be descended from the daughters of different snakes. The chief elements of the story are these. A snake once lived on Makira. It gave birth to a child, who had the form of a human female. When the snake's daughter grew up, she married a man of unspecified origin, despite the snake's warnings that this would be a mistake. The man was unaware that his wife was the daughter of a snake. When the couple had a child of their own, the wife would secretly leave the baby in the care of its snake grandparent while the couple worked their garden. One day, the man discovered his child in the coils of the snake and chopped the snake into pieces. The pieces rejoined themselves, however, and the snake, offended by this insult and assault, left Makira, taking her powers of productivity away to the neighboring island of Guadalcanal. Even Arosi, who do not know all the details of this story, are familiar with the idea that the snake's departure is the reason why gardening on Makira is difficult, while crops allegedly grow well on Guadalcanal and all kinds of fruits are plentiful there. They also know a tradition according to which the snake returns periodically for brief intervals, and when she does so, the autochthonous things of the island flourish again. Understood strictly as a matrilineage origin story, the myth of the severed snake intimates that, in some sense, every matrilineage is a severed snake. At the core of the story lies the generic pattern common to all matrilineage origin stories, the three-generational progression from a seemingly atomistic autochthonous progenitor to an intermediary pre-human daughter who marries a male of unspecified origin to a truly human girl who is the beginning of a matrilineage. But the story also graphically enacts the paradox of how every matrilineage must be cut by another in order to remain unbroken. It narrates the initial cutting and regeneration of the primordial progenitor that will be reenacted in every generation through ongoing exogamous unions. The myth has the effect of revealing the severed snake-like quality of every matrilineal waipo. The two images of elongation, the snake and the umbilical cord, are figural synonyms. The severed snake displays in narrative form the nature of every waipo as both indivisible and infinitely divisible, always able to reassert its original wholeness after every cut, and also to replicate itself in its offspring who constitute new whole parts. Both are icons of endlessly extending scale-invariant self-similarity. Now, this thought that every matrilineage is effectively a snake matrilineage need not, in and of itself, trouble the premises of matrilineage scale paleontology. Even if all Arosi matrilineages were born of autochthonous snakes, the premise of double discontinuity among them would remain unchallenged as long as the snakes were different snakes, envisioned as having appeared and initially lived in atomistic isolation. A problem arises, however, when the myth of the severed snake is allowed to intimate the possibility that it was always the same snake, namely the snake that is also the island as a whole. It is this island-scale severed snake, the myth can seem to suggest, that generated all of the matrilineages through her many localized daughters and their daughters. Suddenly,
Makeira begins to look like one big totemic and exogamous matric clan. For the most part, until quite recently, Arosi have attempted to avoid this conclusion by means of a fascinating manipulation of ontological options intrinsic to scale invariant self-similarity. When they refer to or consider the figure of a single island scale severed snake, they keep it sequestered in time and space from the many matrilineage scale severed snakes. They implicitly regard the dismemberment of the island scale snake and its departure from Makeira as having been prior to the spontaneous appearance out of the pieces of the many snakes to which their matrilineages owe their heterogeneous origins. They attempt, in other words, to assert that the myths, that what the myth says is impossible, that the island scale snake was long ago in the primordial past divided and banished for good, and that the progenitor snakes that gave rise to the matrilineages arose in mutual discontinuity both in and as the pre-segmented pieces. In this way, Arosi exploit an ambiguity found in all models of scale-invariant self-similarity. In any conceptualization of scale-invariant self-similarity, any scale can appear in one or other of two competing lights. Either it stands in continuity of being with all other scales, even to the point of underlying identity, or it stands alone as an autonomous whole, isomorphic to, but discontinuous with all others. Arosi appear to see different scales differently. When it comes to a matrilineal category, they see its exogamously produced children or severed parts as new wholes that mend and extend matrilineal continuity. But when it comes to the primordial island scale severed snake, they see its severed parts as having become new wholes that stood alone, with ontological gaps between them, independently containing everything necessary to make a discrete category of being. In the beginning, then, all that these atomistic wholes needed was, in a sense, swerve, to bring them into mutually severing relations that produced the matrilineal microcosms. For all that, Arosi have never, to my knowledge, gone so far as to deny that the island scale severed snake recovered its integrity. Instead, they've worked hard to keep this aspect of the island snake, its indivisibility, offshore, out of sight, out of mind, on Guadalcanal, the neighboring island, in perpetual self-exile. There is evidence that in pre- and early colonial times, they actively sought to block the reconstituted snake from returning to their part of the island. According to the missionary accounts from the early 20th century, people throughout much of the Southeast Solomons formerly observed an annual harvest festival and offering of first fruits known as the Ho'asia. Charles E. Fox, an Anglican missionary ethnographer and lexicographer who witnessed the festival in 1918, glosses the name as a past participle meaning sacrificed. All missionary accounts agree that this festival was explicitly linked to the veneration of the severed snake and to its return as a time of plenty and purification. It was not celebrated everywhere at once, however, but staged progressively. The festival, which is to say the snake, first arrived at Haununu, a village on the south coast of Makira, east of Erosi. From there, it passed on from village to village, staying several days in each community to receive offerings before being sent on to the next. Eventually, it was returned to Haununu and dismissed again from the island altogether. The staggered nature of these rites suggests that other people on Makira as well as Erosi were reluctant to let the primordial unity of the island reassert itself as a pervasive continuity, even as they sought to benefit from its revitalizing power. By relaying the snake from village to village, they effectively repartitioned it again as it went, reenacting cosmogony without ever reverting to primordial chaos. Significantly, however, Fox reports that apart from a few villages in the region, Erosi exempted itself altogether from this festival. There is no doubt that as a result of Erosi dialogue with Anglican missionaries in the mid to late 19th and early 20th centuries, the figure of the island scale severed snake, with its potential to appear as the unitary creator of a unified humanity on Makira, acquired new prominence and prestige. Several leading figures in what was known as the Melanesian Mission, the Anglican evangelical initiative to the region, clearly promoted this understanding of the severed snake myth as an indigenous prefiguration of monotheism. But there is likewise no doubt that the island-scale severed snake, along with the problems it poses for Erosi ontology, was not a missionary invention. The sliding scales of Erosi paleontology are built into the way that long ago Erosi began to conceptualize their matrilineal categories as discontinuous isomorphs, each one an instance of scale invariant self-similarity, figured both as an umbilical cord and an autochthonous severed snake. It's difficult to resist the conclusion that a perceptibly entitative and relatively small island was bound to get in the way of interlineage double discontinuity in this otherwise tidy totemism. One of the oldest Erosi pictorial designs known to Europeans is the zigzag serpent. The first European to document life in Erosi, the French Marist missionary Léopold Verguet, recorded a very simple example in the mid-1840s. The zigzag tail also appears in diverse images of snakes from elsewhere on the island and remains a popular stylized decorative form. This feature is likewise prominent in a drawing elicited by Fox in the early 20th century from an unnamed Makiran. It's the latter's representation of the androgynous severed snake known as Hataibwari, arguably a remarkably hybrid of a Makiran severed snake and a kind of biblical seraphim. Now, this visual motif, the zigzag, beautifully depicts the properties and ambiguities of scale invariant self-similarity. It's a distinctively Melanesian version of Zeno's dichotomy paradox. Each line segment in the zigzag snake appears amenable to an infinite number of further internal breaks, creating more and more zigzags. It is a line of infinitely many lines. It can expand and contract in length, as do many of the snakes in Makiran myths. It is everywhere the same, no matter where or into how many segments one might cut it. Each part replicates the whole. Is it one line or many? Is any particular instance of it an icon of a matrilineage, or of Makira, or of both, or indeed of even higher scales of cosmic encompassment? The potential scope for monistic inflation would seem to be limitless. It's perhaps not surprising, therefore, that over the past 2 decades, as Arosi struggled to work out what it might mean to be Makiran in a modern multi-ethnic nation state, they've begun to explore some of this potential, chiefly, though not exclusively, the potential for a kind of island-scale totemism. Many historical processes have contributed to this new willingness, at least in some contexts, to put matrilineal discontinuity at risk in favor of the perceived benefits of Makiran unity. These processes have included such things as the administrative division of the archipelago into island-based regions by various colonial and post-colonial governments and ecclesiastical authorities. The classification of islanders into island-defined types by European ethnologists and labor recruiters, and the reduction of matrilineal specific customs to a generic Makiran custom posited as equivalent to an indigenous Makiran Christianity. Well, in one way or another, these and other sites of encounter with the ontological premises of naturalism or Christianity have all encouraged Arosi to experience Makira and its principal neighboring islands as given wholes. Since the turn of the millennium, moreover, a period of civil conflict that ran between roughly 1998 and 2003 has intensified the reification of insular and regional ethnicized identities in Solomon Islands. In this context, many Arosi have raised previously suppressed indices of island-scaled unity from the background to the foreground of their imaginations. On a visit to Arosi in 2003, I was told, much to my surprise, that the snake that went to Guadalcanal has come back. It swam ashore at the western end of the island, at the western end of Arosi, and went into a cavern and has not been seen again. Such talk alone is a clear enough sign that some Arosi are retrieving traditional sources that they find good to think about autochthonous identity at an island-wide scale. There are many other such signs as well. In my most recent publications, I have concentrated on analyzing one in particular, the idea that Makira is the site of a secret subterranean urban military complex known as the underground. The figure of the underground could be summarized, I suggest, as the marvelous, modern, mythic transformation of the figure of the severed snake itself. Now it seems the two of them are down there together inside the island, reinforcing one another as mythic doublets, as the mythic doublets that they are. Furthermore, since the period of civil conflict, which, as I said, ended in 2003, I've found that Erosi discourses are much more likely than before to suggest that Makiran stones and Kakamora, the dwarf-like beings said to still inhabit Makira, are likewise mythic doublets of the severed snake. Or perhaps more accurately, their discourses are now more likely to imply that stones, Kakamora, and snakes are interchangeable manifestations of the mena, the power of an all-pervasive Makiran autochthony. New to me in 2006, for example, was the story of an attempted Kakamora capture in which the intended victim, the Kakamora, evaded apprehension by turning first into a stone, then into a snake, and then back again into its usual quasi-human dwarf-like appearance. I also learned that Kakamora are now widely supposed to possess a so-called Kakamora stone. They keep it under their armpits, a removable appendage or child, as one man described it, that's located in here. Such stones are conceptualized as iterations of the power of each Kakamora, which is itself a form of the power of Makira. A Kakamora, in other words, is itself a stone of Makira, a small-scale replica of Makira, bearing its own, even smaller-scale replica of Makira. Like the severed snake, the figure of the Kakamora now clearly displays the scale-invariant self-similarity of Makira as an infinitely divisible continuity. It makes perfect Erosi sense, therefore, that the Kakamora are said to have masterminded the underground and to power it with their stones. But if the autochthonous things of Makira, Kakamora, stones and snakes, are all biforms of one another, and of the island as an infinitely divisible continuity, then any premise of double discontinuity among matrilineages is clearly under threat here. The very kinds of autochthonous things that were once supposed to have given rise to discontinuous matrilineal categories are losing their specificity and thus their ability to specify, to mark differences. The primordial progenitors of matrilineage origin stories now look less like the autonomous fractions of a pre-dismembered island and more like diverse transformations of the island as a shared intrinsic substance. Older claims to heterogeneous autochthony are being subordinated to newer aspirations to participate in the deeper, fuller mena of Makira, the unbroken primordial power of the Kakamora and the underground. Now, given these changes, should I abandon the concept of polyontology or just admit, as some anthropologists of ontology might urge, that Erosi are now, and always have been, animists? Is Erosi ontology really a snake animism? Is it a peculiar version of animism in which the primordial virtual is not the human, but the snake, the indivisible, but infinitely divisible, molecular snake of which every quasi-entitative kind of body including every Arosi matrilineage, is an intrinsically pre-related molar transformation. In order to give a definite no to these questions, I must now turn to the 3 foundational modifications and 3 ancillary annotations I wish to make to Descola's fourfold grid, which I've projected onto the screen. The first modification I propose is that analogism and totemism should be placed together in the same quadrant of the grid as 2 ways of describing the same mode of identification. There is no analogism that is not also a totemism and vice versa. Here, I hope my previous discussion of Arosi matrilineage origin stories can help us to grasp how any analogism must, by its logic, also be a totemism. Now, Descola defines analogism as double discontinuity between humans and others. But Arosi matrilineage origin stories alert us to the fact that radical double discontinuity is thinkable only as a pre-human condition. In a completely atomistic state, there can be, as yet, nothing human at any scale, individual or collective. In fact, there can be no classes or kinds of things at all by any criteria. There is only a chaos of isolates, and thus no human to stand in relative continuity or discontinuity to anything else. When humans finally emerge, they do so not as discontinuous humans, discontinuous individuals, but as members of totemic collectives that already comprise at least one non-human other, the primordial progenitor that defines them and usually gives rise to many non-human consubstantial others as well. True humans always come pre-totemized, and it is these already differently collectivized humans who then stand in double discontinuity with one another in an analogism totemism, or what I have called a polyontology. Let us redefine this complex mode then as a plurality of double discontinuities hierarchically encompassed by double discontinuities in a classic Dumontian 2-in-1 configuration. In 2014, I wrote a review of Beyond Nature and Culture, in which I noted that although Descola makes little reference to cosmogony when rethinking analogism, he relies heavily on examples of cosmogonies from Australia to explain totemism. The reason for this asymmetry, I now realize, is that the cosmogonies of totemism are the cosmogonies of analogism. On its own, strictly atomistic analogism cannot fulfill the definition of a mode of identification. It is none other than the mythic primordium of totemism. In that same review, I asked the question, where might we locate a truly cosmic double continuity on Descola's grid? Well, based on his research with Yi Qing, diviners in contemporary China, William Matthews has addressed my question with the suggestion that the proper structural inverse to analogism is not totemism, but a cosmic scale double continuity or monism he calls homologism. This, he argues, displaces totemism from its quadrant and reclassifies it as a subgenus of analogism. Well, for reasons I've just rehearsed, I disagree with this description of totemism. My argument amounts instead to saying that analogism is first a pre-totemic primordial phase, and subsequently a way of describing the gaps between totemic classes. Nevertheless, my second proposed modification to Descola's grid is that we accept Matthew's introduction of homologism into the quadrant vacated by the convergence of analogism and totemism. Now, rather than summarize Matthew's account of homologism, however, I'm going to discuss its features when I come to my third proposed modification, which is that animism too should be analyzed as a cosmic scale double continuity or monism. Well, at this juncture, however, I want to pause to make my first minor annotation. In the quadrant newly devoted to the two-sided mode of analogism totemism, I want simply to make explicit what ought to be self-evident, namely that this complex mode of identification is also a structurally hybrid mode. But its hybridity, to be clear, lies not in the coming together of analogism and totemism. Rather, it lies in the way that the totemic aspect of this mode constitutes a series of discontinuous microcosmic homologisms. Now, in my own vocabulary, this has always, I've always intended the term polyontology to refer to everything that is here comprehended in the notion of an analogism totemism with small-scale homologisms. I insert this annotation here just as I'm about to launch into a comparison between animism and cosmic scale homologism for two reasons. First, much of what I'm about to say about cosmic scale homologism applies as well to the microcosmic homologisms of analogism, totemism, and thus to polyontology. And second, the criteria I'm about to identify for distinguishing between animism and homologism as different forms of monism will similarly become relevant to the task of clarifying why a Rossi polyontology should not be assimilated to animism. I suspect that I may not be the only reader of Beyond Nature and Culture to find Descola's definition of animism as continuity of internality, but discontinuity of physicality surprising. This definition seems to take the differences between animistic bodies too seriously. Yes, they are different and generate mutually opaque configurations of the internality that's usually described as human. But they're not ontologically discontinuous, not like the physicalities of different totemic classes. There are no ontological gaps between them. They are arguably no more ontologically discontinuous, in fact, than the physicalities of naturalism. Both animistic and naturalistic physicalities may be described as different arrangements of a single though very different kind of ontological category. Moreover, if animism is really the inverse of naturalism, would that not imply that animism, like naturalism, is a dualism, that the universal internality of animism merely takes up its abode in an array of unrelated container bodies, but is not of them? This doesn't sound quite right, based at least on more recent ethnographic analyses of shamanic and hunter metamorphoses in animistic contexts. But you might well ask, how can there be two different cosmic scale double continuities? The answer to this question resides, I suggest, in the internality physicality distinction itself, and it demonstrates the indispensability of this distinction to comparative ontology. Although they are both monisms, animism and homologism are governed by inverse configurations of the internality-physicality relation. This structural difference, as I will elaborate, corresponds to different models of cosmogony and can account as well for a host of other features that may be identified as diagnostic of each mode. Consider animism first. Animism, I submit, may be defined as a double continuity in which internality and physicality are continuous with one another, but physicality is modeled on internality. Put differently, internality hierarchically encompasses and conditions physicality. This is evident in the way animism figures cosmogony as a series of whole-scale outward transformations of an inwardly unchanging source, a source that's often referred to as the primordial human. Animism, I would argue, is not anthropomorphic. All physicalities are simply inflections of the one internality-based ontology. Internality thus remains constant, equally conserved as universal personhood across all bodies. Thus in turn, yields a tendency in animism towards egalitarian, reversible modes of relation. Moreover, just as cosmogony by whole-scale transformation accounts for the equal conservation of internality across all bodies, it likewise accounts for the lack of microcosmic, macrocosmic correlations in animistic monism. In animism, there is no primordial macrocosm-microcosm rupture. The internality-based primordial human is not dismembered or divided in any way. It is only folded and reshaped repeatedly in toto. There are no fragments of the primordial human to re-aggregate and correlate. Homologism, in contrast, may be defined as a double continuity in which internality and physicality are continuous with each other, but internality is modeled on physicality. Put differently, physicality hierarchically encompasses and conditions internality. This is evident in the way homologism figures cosmogony as the dismemberment or division and multiplication of a primordial body. Often, although not always, the body is patterned on the human body, making many homologisms quite anthropomorphic. All physicalities are but dispersed features or members or re-aggregated fragments of the sacrificed primordial whole. Internality is thus ontologically continuous, but unequally distributed from high to low throughout the cosmos, just as it appears to be unequally distributed high to low in the human and many other bodies. This in turn yields a tendency in homologism towards hierarchical holism with asymmetrical modes of relation. Moreover, just as cosmogony by dismemberment or division accounts for the unequal distribution of internality among its members, it likewise accounts for the prevalence of macrocosm-microcosm correlations in homologistic monisms. When a hierarchically ordered, physicality-based primordial being is sacrificed and partitioned to make macrocosmic things, and its parts are further fractured and reassembled to make microcosmic things, correlations abound. Based on this small set of contrasts alone, we can also highlight a further constant difference between animism and homologism. Homologism entails a hierarchy within a hierarchy. Although physicality encompasses internality at every scale, this hierarchy inverts itself. It does this, on the one hand, by ascribing greater internality to the things pertaining to the uppermost members of encompassing physicality, and, on the other, by ascribing weaker or even no internality to the things pertaining to the lower members. The net effect can be a tendency to devalue much of physicality itself as low on internality. In animism, in contrast, animism appears in contrast resistant to the devaluation of physicality. All physicalities enjoy the same internality in animism. What they lack, and often seek to acquire by metamorphosis or cannibalism, are the capacities of other bodies. Thus, despite prioritizing internality as the blueprint for physicality, animism places higher value on physicality, and despite prioritizing physicality as the blueprint for internality, and homologism places higher value on internality. That said, both modes may be described as cephalocentric. They're focused, that's to say, on the head. But whereas an animist values a head as the fullest locus of a particular physicality and its distinctive capacities such as flight, eyesight, and strength, a homologist values a head as the fullest locus of a particular internality and its distinctive capacities, as a higher consciousness, wisdom, or clairvoyance. A shaman is a man of fuller physicality. A Brahmin is a man of fuller internality. And now this brings me to my second annotation, which applies to the whole grid, but especially to comparisons between animism and homologism. The annotation is this: that the comparative study of ontology must always attend to differences among different modes of cosmogony. These differences, as we have just seen, can have many systematic repercussions. I've only just begun to think through some of these differences myself. So far, however, it seems to me that homologism may yield a greater variety of cosmogonic paradigms than animism. There simply may be more ways to narrate the partition of a physically based mono-ontology than there are ways to narrate the whole-scale transformation of an internality-based monoontology. For my present purposes today, I want to take a closer look at two important cosmogonic models that go together with cosmic scale homologism, namely anthropomorphic dismemberment and emanation. This, I realize, is to neglect the equally important model of kinship generation and probably others as well. My aim, however, is not to be comprehensive, but to explicate most efficiently how and why some homologisms develop what I call animistical or pseudo-animistic features. That is to say, they begin to acquire characteristics that resemble those of animisms, but are, in fact, the outcomes of very different ontologics. By tracing some of these ontologics with respect to their cosmic scale homologism, I'll begin to illustrate some of the analogous processes that have rendered Arossi polyontology vulnerable to misrecognition as a form of animism. Anthropomorphic dismemberment cosmogonies, such as those of the Rig Veda and the Poetic Edda, along with the systems of social hierarchy in natural philosophy and medicine they inform, are among the most familiar and thoroughly studied models of origins and ontology. These are, after all, the cosmogonies that give us the classic homologies of homologism. The skull of the primordial anthropos became the dome of heaven. His brains became the clouds, his blood and other body fluids became the seas and rivers, his flesh, the earth, his bones, the stones and mountains, his hair, the vegetation, his breath, the winds. Portions of all of these things were gathered together again to make human beings as small-scale replicas of the original whole. It is also well known that such homologies tend towards scale-invariant self-similarity. Every part of the primordial anthropos comes to be modeled as itself a small-scale anthropos, an iteration of the human body as a hierarchical distribution of internality from head to foot. But now, even the foot, even the toe, has its own head, a locus of relatively greater internality vis-a-vis its toe. The human body, with its hierarchical distribution of internality, becomes the atom of all things. Everything contains everything. This is when anthropomorphic homologisms can become deceptively animistical. They can begin to redistribute internality in ways that come to look very like universal personhood. When the hierarchical human body is the atom of all things, this reiterates physicality-based internality exponentially at every scale, giving the appearance of a more equally apportioned internality. Furthermore, in such a homologism, every scale, or every entity as a scale, both is what it is and an iteration of the human body, albeit in an highly abstracted form. The human body is present everywhere, not only in humans, but as the true form of everything, a mountain, a spring, a tree, a flower, and so on. Is such a homologism becoming an animism? No. How can we tell? Well, such an animistical homologism might appear to endow everything with equal personhood, but it will always lack truly animistic bodies, mutually opaque, body-specific collectives that see themselves as human. The animistical entities of such a homologism do, of course, come in kinds: tree nymphs, river nymphs, spirits of fire, and so on. But there is no ontological principle for collectivizing them into all but sequestered societies unto themselves. Such beings, as we know from European folklore, do not need to transform in order to intermingle. Unlike animistic bodies, which cannot reveal their internality-based humanity to one another without undoing the differentiating transformations of the primordial human, the non-human beings of anthropomorphic homologisms can appear as their physically based human forms without undoing the dismemberment of the primordial anthropos. When everything contains everything in an anthropomorphic homologism, it does so as scale-invariant physicality. When everything contains everything in animism as per normal, it does so as body-invariant internality. The animationist cosmogony's characteristic of various Neoplatonic and Neoplatonism and Gnosticism are also instructive in this way. In these cosmogonies, the source of all things is often represented as something highly geometric or amorphous, a circle, a sphere, a boundless light emitting sparks. And the entities these abstract sources emanate are equally abstract, generic, and isomorphic in ways that seem to take scale-invariant self-similarity to the maximum degree of homogeneity. It would seem almost impossible for such demythologized and featureless ultimate sources to unfold themselves without the complete conservation of internality across their emanations. Wherein lies the potential for any hierarchical distribution of internality. Yet these cosmogonies are clearly philosophical transformations of the anthropomorphic dismemberment model. Despite their notorious antipathy towards the physical world and the bodies, they are ultimately physicality-based. The monad, the one, the divine mind even, is not an internality-based original condition that transforms itself entirely as everything it animates. It is still a physicality-based primordial whole that fragments, distributing its pleroma of internality from high to low hierarchically. Ironically, the immortal divine or divinity that the monad imparts equally to all its sparks is a property of its physicality, not its internality. Returning finally to Erosi polyontology and its arguably animistical or pseudo-animistic features, I'm ready for my last annotation in the quadrant now occupied by analogism totemism. I would add that, like cosmic scale homologism, the microcosmic homologisms of analogism totemism model internality on physicality and display models of cosmogony based on the partition of original beings. These beings, furthermore, tend to be theriomorphic and simultaneously terramorphic rather than anthropomorphic. As in cosmic scale homologism, this accounts for the relatively unequal distribution of internality within totemic classes. That said, some non-human animal bodies are intrinsically less amenable to hierarchical distribution than the human body. And snake bodies in particular are notably lacking in hierarchically differentiated members. As bodies subject to cosmogonic fraction, they are almost as abstractly featureless as the original monads of the emanationist tractates. Inevitably, therefore, a snake-based interiority looks very evenly distributed, as in animism. Compared to Australia, Makira has relatively few large non-human species. Nevertheless, Arosi always ascribed matrilineally specific insight and moral will to non-human things, even things like stones in their territories. One man told me, for example, about how stones he had encountered while walking in the environs of his village had revealed themselves to him as signs of the extent of his matrilineal territory. And in the recent context of shift towards matrilineal monism, Arosi readily ascribed wisdom and intentionality to the non-human things of their island, such as a singing green parrot. But this is merely a merely animistical aspect of Arosi paleontology. Arosi have never supposed that the non-humans in their territories dwell in their own body-defined collectivities, nor do such beings, other than wild spirits or wild adaro, appear as humans. Arosi have simply understood the non-humans in their matrilineal collectives to participate in and even police their ancestral ways in the land. Now they're inclined to see the autochthonous things of Makira as likewise manifesting the will of the island. Ultimately, however, the governing difference between Arosi paleontology and animism is not only that its homologisms exhibit physicality-based interiority, but also that this physicality-based internality is more specifically land-based internality. This land-based internality, moreover, can be active as one of several equivalent bodies, especially, but not limited to snakes, stones, and kakamora. These are not whole-scale transformations of a primordial internality-based physicality. They are interchangeable land bodies amenable to infinite divisibility. When, as primordial progenitor figures, they came into mutually rupturing reproductive relations, they gave rise to matrilineal categories comprising humans and non-humans whose continuity of internality was the continuity of one particular area of land, or more commodiously now, of the island. With their land-based internality, Arosi totemic classes, whether matrilineal or insular, are simply not assimilable to the body-specific collectives of internality-based animism. Arosi paleontology is not now in the midst of unveiling its previously hidden animistic premises. If anything, it is moving towards its own distinctive version or versions of cosmic scale homologism. For some eclectic thinkers, this has already happened. I met a university-educated Makiran man, for instance, who had discovered theosophy and the legend of the lost continent of Mu. Creatively, he has brought these resources together to theorize that Makira is not only a remnant of Mu, but the ancient site of the Garden of Eden, Makira, in other words, is the homeland of all humanity. For this man, the continuity of Makiran land-based internality has come to encompass all people. Not only that, but the Kakamora, he speculates, are prelapsarian beings who preserve the ancient, unsullied wisdom of Eden. As he put it, the Kakamora have a religion that seems to be original. It's more than Christianity. It's a world that integrates every belief. So just to conclude very quickly, I've tried to show how my research on Erosi paleontology is good to think for improving and growing Descola's grid of 4 modes of identification. In so doing, I've taken liberties with the grid that some people might find too radical. To those who feel I am doing violence to the grid, I beg to differ. In my view, Descola's discovery of the internality-physicality distinction at the heart of ontological differences is just that, nothing less than a discovery. It's the sine qua non for differentiating clearly and fully between animism, as I have redefined it, and homologism, as put forward by Matthews. From this simple distinction, myriad others follow, and differences between different analogism totemisms come into focus as well. To accept my modifications is, I dare to suggest, to answer detractors of the internality-physicality distinction with evidence that it works, that it really does account for the differences that make a difference. How can a rock know which matrilineage a person belongs to? Why is the European folkloric imagination so full of little people? How can these beings fraternize freely with each other when different kinds of non-human collectives in Amazonia cannot? Why does continuity of internality and totemism look so different from continuity of internality and animism? Why do cosmic scale homologisms tend towards the devaluation of physicality? Like Philippe Descola, I want to keep on pursuing the lines of inquiry that precipitate and address these very precise kinds of questions. When the answers seem to fall into place, I experience a kind of wonder that's worth investigating in itself. What ontological premises of mine are being challenged when Descola's approach to comparative ontology makes order appear out of chaos? Well, thank you very much for allowing me to share some of the insights I think I may have had, and for which I credit Descola's unique and revealing approach. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for a highly sophisticated talk. And it's, of course, very satisfying for me to see that my models are taken seriously and can serve as a basis for further complexification of the model. I won't, in fact, answer or comment or respond to some of the suggestions you have made. I would first need to read, in fact, your paper. I think that just a brief comment in the introduction of homologism, or rather the lumping together of totemism and analogism, is, from the formal point of view, something which in fact, I had contemplated, in the sense that it's true that they are formally similar, but it depends from the point of view from where they are seen. Double discontinuity in analogism is seen from the inside of the model, and double continuity is seen from outside of the model for totemism. And of course, double continuity implies double discontinuity when seen from the outside of the model, because it's a series of double discontinuities. So I very much admit that they can be lumped together in that sense. And I think the introduction by Matthews of homologism is a very interesting move. And what you've just done gives substance to this slight transformation of the model. And I also appreciate the fact that in spite of the criticism that have been addressed to the distinction between interiority and physicality, based on the very wrong idea that it's a pure projection of the mind-body distinction, which is of course not at all the case, this distinction can serve as a sort of keystone in order to develop the model. So I won't discuss, because it's the audience has seen it's a very highly sophisticated argument, and although I got most of it, I would first need to read it in order to be able to comment. I would like to go back, in fact, to the Arossi and Makira on the question of polyontology. If the getting back to totemism, Australian-wise, let's say, one of the features, of course, of Australian totemism, of several of the features of Australian totemism, I need clarification about on Makira in order to see how they fit or do not fit with the totemism as I define it and as taken from the ethnographic material of Australia. One is you've shown, I think, your first map is a series of small circles. And I would like to know what status of these circles. I mean, because Arossi is the relationship between Arossi and the other people of the island was not very clear to me in that sense. No, I understand quite well the polyontology of Arossi, but the relationship between the polyontology of Arossi and the polyontology of the island as such, it was not very clear. And in particular, what kind of physical features, let's say, physicality, do they have in common, which would be the case in Australian totemism, where people are made of the same substances, etc. They have the same kind of hair or shade or color. What concrete form does it take in this? The people from the same matrilineages, what do they share, in fact, in terms of physicality? Apart from the fact that they were born in a specific place and their ancestors were the product of a specific cosmogenesis in a specific place, etc. And another aspect of Australian totemism is its relative unboundedness, in the sense that the beings of the dream time emerge and then they travel and they in fact they crisscross huge tracts of land, and they are common to several Aboriginal groups, even people speaking different languages, etc., etc. So this cosmogenesis is in fact extended in space, and although there are elements of that in Makira, because the snake swam towards Guadalcanal and now has gone back, It seems to me that an island system precludes this kind of extension in space of the distribution of moral and physical features in different groups, but that are in fact granted by the same primordial beings. Is my question clear?
Yeah, I think so.
What I'm asking, in fact, is more ethnographic details on this, in order to view better the relationship between the classical Australian model and the Makira model. I must say also that your suggestions, of course, they are extremely stimulating, because they deal with logical possibilities of the model, and this is how I see anthropology. No, it's once you've built a model, then you see what are its possibilities, whether it can integrate or not new ethnographical material. But of course, at each time, much like in the experimental sciences, you need to introduce this material and check the material with the model. So I would need not only to look in detail at your propositions, but also see how they fit different specific material. You've started that in a way, but it would imply also the kind of comparative work that is being done when people undertake this kind of comparatism.
Yes.
So, but Makira and the relationship, let's say, between the Makira model and the classical Australian model.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Philippe. There's a lot of different things that I could respond to, and I suppose the first thing, let me respond to the question about the map with the different kind of bubbles that I projected onto the screen. And of course, that was just a sort of schematic representation of how people in Erosi, in the western end of the island, the people that I've worked with, actually sort of envision their island. So they know their landscape well, and they envision that landscape as basically pre-segmented by matrilineal classes, matrilineal categories, such that each matrilineage has its own exclusive area of land that it's a landholder on, and it can't sort of overlap with another one. The rest of the island, I haven't done field work in the rest of the island.
Can you tell us how many other groups or dialects or language groups or whatever you wish to call them are present in the island?
It's sort of, I think it varies depending on who you ask, but four is sort of the right number. But Erosi, I think, has the more speakers than any of the other languages, than any of the other language groups on the island.
And do they share the Erosi vision? I mean, even if you haven't done field work, is there any ethnography? Because the question about Australia is precisely what is so striking about Australia is that, let's say, basically, I'm speaking under the control of a specialist of Australian Aborigines. There is a basic scheme that is shared by all Aboriginal people in Australia. I mean, there are a lot of differences, but the general scheme is shared, and this is what is so striking. Would that be the case also in Makira?
My sense is that it is. Those non-Erosi people that I've spoken to, what they tell me very much accords with what I've heard from Erosi people. There seems to be perhaps in the center of the island a kind of a more of a moiety type setup there. But I really haven't had an opportunity to do much of any research about that. But it does seem, it seems very similar to what I described for Erosi, really, in terms of their setup. So that was the kind of schematic, just to give people a sense of what paleontology might look like and how it would contrast with an island-wide image of a sort of totemic class at the island level, and how they can sort of switch between those. You ask about how physicality is imagined.
Shared physicality. If you talk about paleontology, it means that each of these lineages is a specific class of being.
Yes.
So how would they be defined as specific classes of being?
When I was there, some member of one matrilineage actually sought to identify me as a member of her matrilineage. And so she took my hand and looked at the lines of my hand and used that as a way of identifying me. But also what she understood to be my sort of mild-mannered and sort of generous spirit was also seen to be a sort of characteristic of her matrilineage as well. So that I was sort of expressing that myself. I think that the common idioms that people use, as I mentioned in the paper, are the umbilical cord, the WIPO, and that is figured, the umbilical cord is often figured as the conduit of a distinctive matrilineal blood, so that each of the bloods of the matrilineage is seen to be fundamentally different.
Which is a common theme in Australia also.
Yes, yes. And also, as I was trying to argue, the categories are primarily land-based. And so it's the relationship between the human and the land and the things of the land in the particular territories that actually constitute the physicality. So I think it would be wrong to think of the physicality as purely something that is of the human. It's a land-based physicality. And so it's almost as if the humans are an aspect of that land-based physicality. So it sort of takes a slightly different starting point than maybe that we would start with the human, I think.
Yes, it's very Australian also.
Yes, I think they would maybe start more at the land and see it as the important thing. And then with respect to the Australian and the difference really between an insular context with these islands that would seem to be to my eye pre-given wholes, really, and Australia being an extensive land that doesn't necessarily have these sort of obvious smaller holes. The island itself, I think, it presents a particular problem for Erosi, because I think that they see it as a whole. And some other anthropologists, particularly working in Vanuatu, have suggested that islands there aren't wholes, that it's the relationship between people of different islands that actually constitute the sort of key way of orienting their mode of being, their way of kind of orientation to the world. But it seems to me that certainly among Erosi, the island itself is a kind of significant unit, and that's figured in the story of the snake, and the need, the sort of primordial, the need to pre-segment the island to establish the totemism as a double discontinuity between the totemic classes. But the possibility of the wholeness of the island coming back into view is a sort of ever-present possibility, whether it's the snake returning from the neighboring island, or whether it's through the colonial classification of the island as a whole, as a political unit, or as a unit of church organization. The snake being that goes off to the other island, it's not at all clear that the people on Guadalcanal who are connected to the snake at that end conceptualize themselves as members of the same same totemic class as in Omakira. And so they do have narratives about the snake as well, and I've heard some of those. And so they see themselves as being, you know, kind of the receivers of the snake, as it were, the recipients. And some people there are connected to the snake, but I haven't heard of them thinking of themselves or being thought of as the members of the same matrilineage. No. So I don't know if that answers answers your question about that.
It's just a slight remark,
yes.
a comparative remark. It's interesting to see that, in fact, the insistence on the scales of the snake, no, and this idea of sliding scales, because in Amazonia, the anaconda is a central figure. And it's a central figure because precisely it's a continuous, it's seen, it's not, there's no emphasis on the scales. There's an emphasis on the continuity, in particular on the continuity of the chromatic aspect. If you've seen an anaconda in the light, there's no discreteness there. It's a continuity of colors. It's completely chromatic, no? And it's exactly the reverse, in fact. And it's why the anaconda is the epitome of metamorphosis and transformation, because it's constantly transforming, by contrast with birds, where there's a chromatic distinction, which is very neat. And in this case, they insist on the scale, on the complementary scale of this, and so it's why it's not animist, I would say.
It's interesting. I mean, when you were saying that, well, it puts me in mind of, you know, people would tell me, each members of a matrilineage would tell me, you know, to watch out. We had this snake. I stayed with this one old man in this village, and a snake used to come into our house at night, and it made me feel very uncomfortable. And I said, you know, we should get rid of it. And he said, well, we can't, because, you know, it's a relative. And I said, well, you know, how do you know it's a relative? You know, it just looks like a snake to me. And he said, we know it's a relative because it's a half snake. It's been cut in half. And so it doesn't have a tail. And so in the way that people actually conceptualize snakes there, it's sort of figured as, you know, the scale.
It's a scalar being. Yes,
yeah, that's right. So, I mean, that's the kind of analogy, I suppose, with the anaconda in Australia. I mean, the way that the snake is figured differently.
Questions? Yes, Nicole.